Hello, my name is Dr. Scott Davis, and I'm professor of philosophy and interim dean of the Caldwell College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences here at Morehead State University. Today's call conversation features Dr. Morgan Getchell from Communication and Dr. Nettie Brock from Communication. We're going to be talking about media literacy and changes in the way we consume information. And I think we're going to start today with Dr. Brock, if you would.
Absolutely. So this is what I do. I am a critical media scholar, and I attest a lot of that to the fact that I grew up with the media. I have literally always had a computer in my house. I have always had this sort of technology. My parents were super nerdy about it. But what that means is I am a digital native. And this is a phrase that we use to describe people who grew up with technology. So Dr. Getchell is also a digital native. Dr. Davison, I don't know if you are, um, but you might be. You know, it sort of depends on households that we are brought up in. But all of our students and all the future generations, all of them are digital natives because even if they didn't have the money to have them in schools, they had them in the classroom, and so they grew up using these things. And so digital natives is more than just a thing that we say to describe people who grew up with technology. But Prensky in 2001 is the one who introduces this term. And when he's talking about it in the way that we consume knowledge. And he's basically saying that people who are digital natives do not consume knowledge the way that older generations do, because no longer do we need to know like facts just in our brains. We don't have to memorize or anything like that. We need to know how to look up the answers. You know, people make jokes all the time about how in high school, our math teachers would always say, well, you're not going to have a calculator in your pockets. And yet we all have calculators in our pockets now. And like that is like emblematic of what is happening with media and how we are sort of digital natives. Um, and so it means that we sort of have this advantage over people who are not digital natives, that we can do things a lot easier. Like it's just easier for people like us who know how to use these things. But at the same time, being raised in a house or in a school with technology does not necessarily mean we know how to be literate with that technology. All it means is we know how to use it. And so we have to make sure that we are critical in all of our media usage. And so the main way that we can make sure that we are using the media in a literate, meaningful way is to critically examine the media. And when I say that, I don't mean judging the media. I don't mean that we're going to say, well, this stuff is good and this stuff is bad. That's not useful. What I mean is looking really intensely at things and investigating basically why that thing was made. What is the purpose of this media text? Um, and so we can do a lot of that. There's lots of sorts of questions we can ask ourselves when we are confronted with basically any media text. And by media text, I literally mean anything we look at in a media source. That's all I mean. And we can ask questions about who's paying for it, who are the like people behind it, what themes are embedded in that text, and why are they trying to translate those themes to me, because it could be subconscious, but it could be purposeful. And so thinking about those sorts of things, that's how we ensure that we are media literate. Marshall McLuhan is one of the biggest media scholars, sort of name recognition wise. And his big thing is he says that the medium is the message, that we need to be paying attention to the actual medium as well as the message because they work together. But he also says that we are in a global village right now. And this global village is what means we need to be super media literate. We need to be paying a lot of attention because the whole world is all communicating together. And just because we understand one thing one way here doesn't mean people understand it the same way other places. And so we need to make sure that we are communicating in a media literate way so that everybody around the world is doing things meaningfully and not just consuming sort of mindlessly.
Thank you. It's very helpful to distinguish being a digital native from being media literate. So Dr. Getchell, what are your thoughts about this question?
Yes, so Dr. Brock is correct. I am a digital native, but I think that we can make a little bit of a distinction between some elder natives and some younger natives because while I did also grow up, with a computer in my house pretty much from go, I think the dividing line comes when if you played the dial-up internet tone, do you know what that means versus our students and younger who never knew a life before Wi-Fi. And did your mom ever tell you to get off the internet because she was expecting a phone call kind of thing? So if we look at the last 30 years and the number of huge technological developments that have impacted all of this and how, our lives and our childhood and our education went versus our students, it wasn't until 1991 that the internet became available, the World Wide Web became a thing. In 1997, just 36% of US homes had a personal computer, but by 2016, that was up to 89%. MySpace launched in 2003. It wasn't necessarily the first social network, but it was pretty much one of the bigger ones, the one that had the biggest number of users. And then it kind of was overtaken when Facebook launched in 2004. But what I think a lot of people don't realize or remember is that its original inception, Facebook was just for college students. You had to have a .edu email address to sign up for an account. Now, of course, it's open to everyone. And then, Apple releasing its first iPhone in 2007. And I didn't get an iPhone or any kind of a smartphone until I was in college. My first phone was a flip phone, which I thought was just the coolest thing ever. Our students are literally getting their first phone is an iPhone when they're like 10 years old. So I think that really is kind of this dividing line and why, I had to explain traveler's checks to my students the other day. There's really not that much. If you look at the age gap between us and our students, it's maybe 10 to 12 years, which doesn't sound like a lot. But in terms of how they grew up and the differences in the technological worlds in which we grew up in are really very different. And I think we're at this unique tipping point where the baby boomers and the older generations are on their way out of the workforce and professional life and that kind of thing. And it is this new generation who didn't just have computer labs in their schools, but were given a Chromebook or had, a personal tablet that they used in the classroom every day. And like I said, got an iPhone for their 10th birthday. That's the new generation. But Dr. Brock is exactly right that we cannot conflate an ability to use technology and to know how to open up Google and do a search with understanding all the mechanisms behind how those results are being populated. How, why is this, this number one? How did this get to be the number one result on my Google search? What does it mean when I click it? What is the information being gathered behind the scenes? All that kind of thing. So conflating ability to use technology with media literacy is something that I think we need to avoid. And why? Because this generation is having the technology just, in their hands from birth, we need to make media literacy, as Dr. Brock was describing it, a key part of curriculum from day one.
Thank you. I have a question about this idea that the medium is the message and the idea that we should be taking a critical look at the media text that we're consuming. You mentioned some of the layers or the pieces that go into a given text and trying to understand it and appreciate it and critically examine it requires knowing some things about who produced it and why and what the purpose was. Um, isn't it often the case that it's difficult to discover those things, to figure out what the elements are behind something like that?
It actually isn't that hard. You just have to actually want to find it, but it's mostly on Wikipedia, honestly. You can go to the Wikipedia page for just about anything, and you have to do some clicking around, right? You have to sort of find the person who find the person, find the person. We do an exercise like this in my class, and it takes some work, but it's almost all on Wikipedia. Those people are on the ball, whoever's editing those Wikipedia entries. Now, whether or not that actually shows you who's like really behind it, right? Because it's not like the Wikipedia page tells us about the ideologies that those companies really are holding true to. And so then there's a lot more to it than that. But in many ways, you can pretty easily figure out who is responsible for things most of the time. That's not always true, right? There's right now been some stuff in the media about AT&T basically being the power behind the OANN network. And that was all really hidden for a while because it's kind of unclear what exactly the role that AT&T plays in that network is. And so like, it's not in that Wikipedia page because you can't really see it there. But a lot of that information is actually pretty easy to find if you go out and you actually actively are searching for it. We just don't want to search for it most of the time. And so we're just like, I'm going to accept this. But you can find it pretty easily if you know that you have to keep going up. Basically, it's like if you're mad at the store and you want to get results, you have to keep talking to managers up the chain. It's the same thing. You just have to keep looking farther. You have to keep seeing who's paying for things.
Yeah, I think, and we talked about this a little bit in our other conversation. I think a good first question to ask is, kind of follow the money. Who is paying for this? And if the product is free, chances are that you are the product. So it doesn't cost a thing to have an Instagram account, a Facebook account, a Twitter. It doesn't cost anything to read articles on Huffington Post and these other blog sites until your eyes cross. You will come up against a paywall on traditional news sites like New York Times, Wall Street Journal, et cetera. So when you think about, why am I having to pay for this versus why this information is free? Well, again, it's like we talked about all that stuff on the back end happening that turns you into a product for consumption by these companies.
It sounds like the process you're describing is a way of tracking down stable sources of information like websites and blogs. If somebody's, just reading tweets and they find an interesting meme that suggests, some statistics, did they try to go through the same process of tracking down that information, figuring out where it came from, looking for a source before they let it register, so to speak, as a stable touchstone in their mental picture of the world?
I mean, I don't know, because I think it would depend on the person. But they could. There are websites that track the history of memes. So as soon as something becomes a pretty stable meme, the Know Your Meme website, which is a wiki, just like Wikipedia, but it is one that exists and is pretty reliable on having the information. They have their sources cited. Will track where that meme comes from. And then also just a lot of memes contain information that you can find clarified on something like Snopes. And so if you Google the information in a sort of meaningful way, it is likely that the origin of that information will come up. But that requires you knowing how to do the Google right. And, that's putting things in quotes and making sure you include words like Snopes or PolitiFact or something like that so that you're looking in the right spaces.
What you describe here, the process of investigating the sources like this and the exercise you mentioned in class that students do, makes me think about an earlier conversation where we talked about a digital divide and differences in access. It sounds like not everybody is really equipped to do that kind of investigative work, in the sense that they don't have the tools or the understanding to do it well. And I wonder about just the time and effort involved for a lot of people, going back to the idea that the medium is the message. One of the things about the medium is that it's fast paced, right? It's very quick. You're moving from one text to another rapidly, and they all register at some level. This is a change, I guess, from the way people used to consume media, right? That has serious implications about how reliable the stream of information is we're exposed to.
And I think it does become easier, with practice. You can look at something from, you can just recognize something from like Occupy Democrats or Breitbart or InfoWars. Once you have a base level understanding of how these sources, where they come from and how they're funded and who's behind them. It's not like every single thing you have to go up the chain and up the chain. There, kind of, it's like, running, you get better with practice. And it becomes easier to know right off the bat what can be dismissed. So I don't think, and that's why I think, again, not to be totally fatalistic about it, it's too late for some in today's world to expect that they are going to put the mental energy and time into this type of thing. But for our younger generations, it can be, part of the curriculum, and it can be an easy, thing for them to do. It can be just a natural part of how they consume information on the internet.
There's also an extent to which the various media that we're talking about are making it easier for us to check our sources. So Facebook and Twitter have been doing a lot to try to make sure that if things are giving misinformation, they are either deleted automatically or are flagged as having misinformation in them. YouTube is also doing the same thing with misinformation. Actually, interestingly, I just last night watched an episode of Last Week Tonight, the John Oliver show on HBO, that was specifically talking about this issue, because it is quite easy for us to figure things out. In news articles, there's usually hyperlinks to sources or other stories that would sort of connect these pieces together. But in other cultures, that is not a thing. A lot of the apps that they use, like WhatsApp and whatever's the big one in China that I have totally forgotten the name of, they don't have that ability, and so they just share a lot more misinformation because the apps themselves do not make it easy. Whereas here, actually, our apps make it pretty easy for us to check the information. And so we, in many ways, are providing people with the tools that they need to confirm that without having to do too much extra effort. So that's, I mean, good for us and not good for the other cultures.
However, I will say that we are in this country up against a unique force in this growing movement of fake news, don't trust the media, that is being shouted by certain political figures and political parties. So I think it makes this mission even harder when, folks like us are saying, here's how you determine what good information, what good sources are, and here's the right media to be looking at. And then you have a whole group of people saying it's all trash, it's all bad, the government's lying to you, they don't want you to know the truth. So those very loud, very conflicting messages it's a unique set of circumstances.
Talking about consuming media makes me think about nutritional analogs. We talk about learning how to shop in the store for healthy food and what to consume and making wise choices. And hopefully we're trying to get, kids off to a good start in the same way, educating them about what they consume. And so I'm thinking about this idea that, we need to help people be better consumers and choose wisely. And it sounds like there are ways to be better consumers. And so in that sense, it seems like it's reasonable to expect people to make wise choices. But I also think in the nutritional realm, we're quick to blame people for bad nutritional choices without understanding all the circumstances that contribute to their history of choices. And so I'm assuming there's some sort of analog of that here, where we sort of think, well, people should be better consumers, but I don't know, can we blame them for having bad beliefs if they're based on bad media consumption? How strongly do you feel about that in terms of holding people responsible for what they've consumed, given the way things flow?
I taught a class last semester on public opinion in the news media. And one of the things that I asked them early in the semester was like, tell me one of your deeply held beliefs, one of your opinions that you just really believe in, and where do you think that comes from? Because it's not anybody's fault that they believe something, but there is a sort of cultural and social upbringing that is going to be responsible for that. And so, I always use myself as an example here because I grew up here in Eastern Kentucky, but my parents are Southern California hippies. And so I did not grow up with the sort of standard ideologies that are common here. And my father's a professor. And so I grew up in this very liberal space, this sort of liberal center in the middle of Eastern Kentucky. And so I tend to be a lot different than my students. And I always make sure I talk about that because there's a reason that I am different from you. But that's not a bad thing and we can find common ground. And so I think that we can't fault people for ending up in these, what we call echo chambers of the same things because it's not their fault. They grew up like that. It's just sort of social and cultural. And, there's a lot that you just want to educate them to be a little bit better and not get stuck no matter what. We want everybody to learn how to question what's happening.
Yes, I would agree with that. And I think that it is a little bit of a sliding scale. I think the vast majority of people like Dr. Brock said, you cannot blame them for the circumstances of their upbringing and the messages that they were, inundated with from birth. Now, on the other end, there are some people, I'm thinking kind of like the QAnon Holocaust denier, like level 10 conspiracy theorists, where maybe, yes, we can put a little bit more blame on your inability to process valid information. But I think, like you said, with nutrition, do we blame people for their poor food choices? I think it does kind of come down to finances. You can get a Big Mac for $2, and you can get news for free on, BuzzFeed, but you can pay $5 for a bag of spinach, or you can pay, I don't know what the subscription rate for the New York Times is, but it really is a financial equation. So, why would I pay for the gross spinach when I can get the cheaper Big Mac? And it's kind of the same thing. People, like we said, like echo chambers, we're all guilty of it. We like to have our opinions reflected back to us in the media we consume. So I want to, bite of that tasty Big Mac for free or cheaper than, putting myself into the spinach realm.
I do think that there's also a connection we could make here with food and nutrition and addiction, and the fact that like sugars and things we can't sort of stop eating, and we can't stop consuming. In many ways, consuming things online can become an addiction, especially something like QAnon. You can't stop. You can't just get out of that. And so we could make that same connection too. Also, BuzzFeed has perfectly good articles sometimes, Dr. Getchell.
It's not all bad. I do the dumb quizzes too. I've built my perfect breakfast to see how tall I am and all that crazy stuff. It is, you can get lost in those, and yes, it's there's room in every diet for a Big Mac every once in a while. It just can't be our daily consumption, as evidenced by that documentary, The Super Size Me.
And philosophers talk about whether belief itself is voluntary, whether we choose what to believe. And I think there's something like a consensus that we really don't control what we believe. And that's sort of maybe by design, that belief is supposed to reflect our total information. Although there are questions about self-deceit and things like that. But I think philosophers would agree that for the most part, whether you seek evidence can be something that's voluntary, without getting into the whole free will debate, which is another conversation. But so seeking evidence might be something under one's control, and whether we hold people responsible might be related to whether they're inclined to seek evidence to confirm their beliefs. I remember when, I'm going to reveal my digital age here, when most of the news came through network television, and there was a public option that occupied about a quarter of the bandwidth, roughly, in terms of news. And now it seems like the public options have really shrunk, or at least the influence has really shrunk. And this takes us to a different conversation about media production and finances and media and money, which we recorded recently. It makes me wonder about whether there should be a stronger effort to provide public information in a way that's more accessible or has a deeper impact. Do you think there's any movement in that direction, or do you see the public information sources just basically fading away by competition here?
I mean, Morgan may be able to speak a little bit more to this because it's a little bit more crisis communication. But I think that those public sources are out there, and people are just ignoring them. It still exists in many of the same ways it used to. PBS is there in the exact same way it used to be. All of our major public information places have social media accounts, and people just ignore them. And so I think this is a matter of consumption and choice, and the people aren't choosing that anymore.
Yeah, it's just gotten so cluttered, and the amount of competition for our attention has made it so, we talk in media theory about agenda setting, which is this idea that the media doesn't tell us what to think, but they tell us what to think about. So whatever they choose as their, top story of the day, breaking news, the things that they cover end up being what the public thinks is most important, and what gets left out doesn't get talked about. But with this new landscape, that's shifted a little bit. Now they are looking more for what we want to hear about because they're fighting for our attention. And like we talked about in the previous conversation, that's often because that translates to money for them. So it's shifting this agenda setting a little bit to where, the choice is more on us. They recognize that, so they are trying to make it easier for us to choose them as their source, and that does leave the traditional news sources, which have shifted. People say print is dead. That's not true. There are not as many hard copy print newspapers as there were 50 years ago, but the New York Times is online. People subscribe. That it's still very much a thriving industry in that way. But yeah, people are just ignoring it because the New York Times isn't telling you what you want to hear about, how Donald Trump is either the devil or God himself reincarnated.
Well, and related to agenda setting, something that we talk about in all my classes is framing, and that the media always has a frame. It always has some sort of perspective on things, and students are often horrified by this. Like, what? And I'm like, have you ever tried to do anything without having some sort of bias to it? And they're like, oh, yeah, and I'm like, no, there's no but here. We talk about how the media is supposed to be unbiased, but that is physically impossible. And so there's always going to be an agenda that the media is sort of trying to set, and that is to get you to watch them, but also to convince you that some things are good and some things are bad. Like, I mean, they're not going to be like, murder is good, but there are always going to be like, murder is bad, and you should not do murders. And so there's always going to be a frame there. And we get a little freaked out by that because we talk so often about bad frames, but like everything has a frame. And so I think that people get a lot stuck and are like, well, if everything's going to have a frame, I'm going to just pay attention to my own things and not the other things because they're trying to change my mind. Well, everybody is, and so it's this weird space, I think, with choosing and choice.
Can you remind us before we end here of the two websites you mentioned for checking things? You mentioned Snopes, I think, and there was one about memes.
That one's just called Know Your Meme. Yeah. Snopes, and then there's also PolitiFact. That one's also checking the actual sources. But yeah, Know Your Meme is a wiki of meme history. Basically, it's an actually very interesting space. I've been doing a lot of research on memes lately, so this site gets quoted in most of my work these days, which is ridiculous. But there you go.
Well, this has been really interesting, and there's a lot to think about here and talk about more. And I really appreciate your time. So thank you both, Dr. Brock and Dr. Getchell. This has been another edition of the College Conversations. We look forward to future conversations and encourage everyone to be literate consumers of the media they consume. So thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.